Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. So in this tutorial series we will learn about what is exception handling and how we are going to handle exception or error in Spring Boot. Okay, so our first question should be, what is exception? So exception is basically an unforeseen condition that occurs in our code while we are doing something, or while fetching any input, or while handling any program or anything, any business logic inside it. So to handle that exception or error correctly in the Spring Boot APIs, and provide the meaningful error messages or description, is what we are going to handle in our Spring Boot application. So exception handling Spring Boot is like the ability to handle errors correctly, and while providing the meaningful error description messages, as it can help the API client or front-end user to respond to that issues properly and quickly. So the default behaviors while we are throwing an exception in Spring Boot, I'll be showing you that first. Like, suppose if I throw an exception or doesn't handle exception handling in Spring Boot. So the default error handling Spring Boot provides is, it basically throws in stack trace that are hard to understand and ultimately useless for the API client, because it a long messages throwing up all the stack trace, like how the flow of the exception occurs, like from this class to that class. Many of you can understand that. So let's jump onto the code first. So this is the code that I have built last in my Spring Boot application, and previously I have shown you like how we can start up Spring Boot application. So I'll be starting up my application, and then I'll be running this API endpoint from my Postman, and I'll be first throwing a valid username, and we can see a hello Java message can be there. But if I throw any null or invalid input, then only hello Java would be there. So to handle this, suppose if I write here, if username, or let me just make use of string utils, if string utils is not blank username, then I'll be throwing through new null pointer exception. Okay, now I'm just going to restart my application. So what this method will do, it will check for any null or empty username input provided from the Postman. So I'll be providing null. So we can see a default error message or default Spring Boot handling has been started here, and this is we can see Spring throws up a long stack trace, and kind of message has been useless for the front end user or API client user. Like he'll not be able to understand like why this message has been thrown, or what was the reason behind throwing up that kind of exception. So we'll learn about it, like how to handle these type of exceptions and errors in Spring Boot. So there are some annotations in Spring Boot that we are going to use, and we'll learn about those annotations. So those annotations includes RestController that I have already used in my controller application, used to manage the REST application client and denote the REST application class. Okay, and exception handler is basically a Spring annotation that provides a mechanism to treat all exceptions thrown during that execution of handlers. So we'll be using this exception handler inside our controller class only, so that will serve as an entry point for handling a certain type of exception. Suppose null pointer or array out of bound exception has been thrown, then in that controller class this method will handle that exception. Okay, but this exception handler belongs to that controller only. Okay, it will not belong to other controllers. Suppose if any other controller we are working upon apart from a user controller, there is some register controller is there, so this will not work, because this is generic to controller, not globally. We can define exception handler and can handle that type of exception. So for that thing, like suppose I wanted to handle a user defined exception or user invalid exception or some kind of exception globally, a controller advice annotation is there. So the name suggests advice, we can use for multiple controller. It basically enables us to handle a single exception being thrown in any class, be it controller, any service class or repository class. So this class will handle that exception and provide us the valid error messages, valid API error codes, and valid messages being provided to the user interface user. Okay, so by using this exception handler and controller advice, we'll be able to define a central point, like to treat our exception and wrapping them in an error object. Okay, so we have already seen like the default error handling that Spring provides, and it provides as a timestamp, status, error, a long stack trace, and a message. So the default attributes generate some good fields are there, but the fields are too focused on the exception. We can see in our postman a long stack trace is there, error is there, but not properly defined. The error message, like what was the reason behind the error message is there, like no message available, but what was the reason why no message has been available here. So we'll learn about it, how to handle and to enable it into a useful message so that front-end API user can also respond back. Okay, so let's just handle this exception first. So suppose I have thrown here null pointer exception, and null pointer exception has been thrown, but if you want, you can also throw a valid exception here and respond back to the user with a status code and a valid message. So I'm going to use response status exception class that has been introduced in Spring 5. So I'm just going to enable here http status dot OK. I have used here http status as OK, not like any 401 or 201, because I do not want to break my UI page. I just wanted to provide a valid error message or exception message and not want to break my UI. Okay, so that's why I have used http status dot OK and not any other status. Okay, so I'm just going to provide a message here, invalid null user has been provided. So I'm just going to stop again and restart my application. We can see a error has been OK here, status has been 200, and we can see invalid null user has provided here. Okay, but we can see messages, okay, clear, error is there, status is there, but we can also see the long stack trace has been there and timestamp is there. It's not an appropriate error response or JSON response we wanted to send to our user. So for that, there has been some mechanism we can implement in Spring and can use some of the classes to send back a good response and handle these exception in a better way, in a globally way. I don't want to define for every exception this response status exception. I'm just going to throw my exception on a generic class will handle all of my certain kind of exceptions there, and for that it's going to provide a valid error code and a valid status and a valid message there. So let's move on to that topic. So we'll be going to define a class API error that will be enough fields to hold some relevant information like debug message. If there are sub errors or sub exceptions are there, timestamp would be there, message would be there, status would be there. So let's move on to the code part. So let's move on to the code part. So we can see that, like, besides a well-formed error response, what we can see on Postman, the payload is not still giving us any useful information, and even though the message field is filled up, which we might want to confirm, like something like invalid user or null user has been provided. So we can start by fixing this error message issue, and we can use that response status instead of this, but still we can see that after using this Spring Boot that response data exception, the stack trace and there are some other fields are still there, but still we want a meaningful error message should be there. Okay, Coming back to the exception, suppose if I wanted to handle this null pointer exception, I can also define a method and can use a annotation exception handler inside this controller class and can also handle that exception. So I'm just going to show you guys that thing also. And what was the reason behind we are not using this anymore? So using response entity object, handle invalid user exception, and just throwing null pointer, and above this method we are going to annotate with exception handler inside this null pointer exception class. So whenever null pointer exception class or whenever this exception is thrown, then automatically this method will be picked up, and this method is going to handle that exception with a valid user message and with a valid status code. Okay, so now return response entity object, and inside this I'm going to write invalid null user has been provided. Okay, and I'm just going to write string type and also provide that. Okay, so let's just run our program again. Okay, we can see invalid null user has been provided, a message has been thrown up there. So suppose instead of client API client expecting a response entity object or a response object there, he'll get a valid message there with a valid HTTP status code. Okay, so in this case the UI flow will not break, a UI page will not broke and will not show us any red color exception message there. Instead of a simple exception message or a valid pop-up should be printed up there. Invalid user has been provided and this is not a valid user and with a valid code. So in this way there is also a way we can handle the exception. But what happens with this way is, like, I need to always define my exception inside a controller. Okay, so if I am using any user controller or any registered controller, so for every custom or any user defined exception I need to define my exception method inside that controller. So we're going to use a generic exception, so where we'll be defining a class. Let me just create the package. Exception is there. Okay, and I'm just going to define my class and I'll name it as rest exception handler. Okay, and I'm going to annotate this class with rest controller advice. Okay, so what's the difference between a rest controller advice and a controller advice? So controller advice basically is a specialization of the component annotation that allows us to handle exception across the complete application in one single class, in a one global handling component. Okay, it can also be viewed as an interceptor exception thrown by certain methods with request mapping and similar. So it declares exception handler in it minder or model attribute methods inside this. And the rest controller at the rate rest controller is equal to controller plus response body. So in a similar way, rest controller advice is equal to controller advice plus response body. So we need not to use this response body annotation inside our class. Okay, so while keeping this in mind, rest controller advice is more convenient annotation for handling a globally handling exception in a single class with restful API. Okay, so we can have a common place for error handling, similar error response body with the proper HTTP status code across all APIs are there. REST controller advice provides us the combination of both controller advice and response body, and the annotation can use this. Okay, and this annotation has been introduced in Spring 3.2. Okay, and the difference between, like, I have already shown you exception handler and now I'm going to show you controller advice using advice, is that, like, exception handler already told you, works at a controller level. All it works in a single controller, and for a particular controller we need to again and again define our exception handler method. It will not work for globally or for entire exceptions in the application. Okay, and controller advice or rest controller advice used for global error handling, and in the Spring MVC application it also has a full control over the body and the response with the status code. Okay, so Spring 3.2 provides us a exception handler with the controller advice annotation, and Spring 5 introduced the response status exception class. So I have also shown you, like, in this way we can throw any status exception with status code, with error message, and with the exception stack trace. But I'll not choose this way, because I'm not going to define complete sorry, I'm not going to process or send the complete response over the response entity. I'm going to provide my custom error message with certain attributes. Okay, so let's see that way what I'm telling you. Let me also define with a flow diagram so it can better understand. So suppose from the Postman client, I'm calling my API endpoint, and it goes to controller, then through service, and inside service it throws an exception. Suppose resource not found exception. Okay, so after throwing this exception, it will go to my global exception handler, where this class handle exception, specific and global exception in a single place, and this class will be providing the response to the Postman client. Okay, and this client will be handling that, okay, back to the API client. Okay, so let's move to the code. So coming back to the code, I have did copy okay, let me just copy. I haven't copied it in my exception handler, so I'll copy the same code what I have defined there, but the difference between the two would be like, just let me import this first. Okay, so the difference between the two would be like, we'll be providing the response in a single message. That shouldn't be we will be doing here. So we'll be defining some more classes here. The first one would be API error class, and with the help of this class we'll be providing a certain attributes in the response. So I'll be naming this class API error, and inside this class we will be using HTTP status and local date time. I'll be using, and this will be timestamp what earlier we are printing, but in a readable format. Along with, I'm providing a pattern. Date should be like always dd yy. Okay, and our minutes and seconds. Also, I'm going to provide JSON type information, and I'll be including and property. I'll be naming it as error, and visibility I'm providing it true. Okay, and there is one more, JSON type resolver. So I'll be commenting this as of now, and just let me see if I have annotated. Okay, I haven't annotated or used Lombok, so I'm just going to define everything with myself. That includes the constructors and setter getters also. I'll be defining error code before this. And in case there are sub error, so let me just also define a class first. API sub error in case we have multiple exception, so in that case I'll be providing a list of sub error, and let me just make this as abstract, and we will be implementing this class inside. Okay, I need to create this class first. API validation error. Okay, so let me include Lombok annotation. I'm just going to generate one constructor, adding these two, and going back to my API error. Done the code with API sub error, and now coming back to the API error, we're going to define some constructors here, and as I have defined here annotation JSON type info. Let me just also open this annotation class as it's an interface. And so basically what's the purpose behind using this is like the purpose of these annotation is to support polymorphism on deserialization. When deserializing this actual code being executed, the class what it expects, the type of some field being deserialized into. But if this class has subclasses, like I'm going to define a subclass here, how does the generic Jackson deserialize know like what actual class the string being deserialized is? It's got to create an instance of some concrete types, the class concrete types, the class or one of its subclasses, and fill it up. The only way we can know which one to create is that information is written into this serialization in the first place. So basically this says like there are three basically ways to do it. You need to pick one, like JSON type info or JSON subtype is one of those ways. So it works great, like when you do at the compile time all of the possible subtypes that could exist of the class in this. Okay, so JSON type info, like we have this define include wrapper object uses custom property error and visible is true. And if you're going to read this here info, that includes this annotation used for configuring details on if and how type of information is used with JSON serialization and deserialization, to preserve information about actual class of object instances. This is necessary for polymorphic types and maybe needed to link abstract declared types and matching concrete implementation. And this class can be used both in classes and properties, but if both exist, annotation on property has the precedence. Basically the way Spring does the precedence over if we are going to use annotation or we are going to use the properties. Okay, so let me define one more annotation here, like the one here mentioned. On serialization side, Jackson will generate type ID by itself except if there is a property with name that matches property, in which case value of that property is used instead. So I'm going to define ID here. Let me just define that class first here. So I'm going to define that class here. That name is lowercase class name resolver. Okay, and I'm going to extend this class with type ID resolver base. Okay, and we are going to also override implement its methods. And I'm just going to override this return value dot get class dot get simple name lowercase. Okay, ID from same ID from value, and I'm going to pass the value object here, and inside this I'm going to return JSON type info dot ID dot custom as we have defined here in the API error. Okay, and now I'm going to annotate this class with one more annotation that I have told you, JSON type ID resolver. And inside this class I'm going to mention lowercase name resolver class. Okay, now I'm going to define some default constructors here that we are going to use in our class. API error default one first. So local date and time, or should I change this to timestamp to be more precise? Like earlier, if you guys remember, if we throw any exception, timestamp would be in the JSON response object. Means Spring Boot default error stack trace that Spring provide. Timestamp is the name, so I'm just going to not rename that. So timestamp I will be using here, and local date time dot current time, and one more constructor where I'll be only providing HTTP status, and I'll be first calling my default constructor, then default HTTP status. Okay, now third parameterized constructor, I'm going to provide all the info that we have used. HTTP status, then error code, let me just move this up in a sequence. I actually like the way use, be it in the parameter arguments or in the classes. Throwable exception, HTTP status, then my message would be unexpected response and this dot error code 1001, this dot exception. Why I'm just mistake. Okay. Oh, sorry. This dot debug message. There's not exception. I have defined any field. Exception dot get localized message. One more constructor I need to define. HTTP status and then string message, integer error code, and then the last variable exception. Just copying the above response so that to save time. HTTP status would be same, and what I'm missing, okay, message I'm going to not use this default, and error code would be the provided one. In this case also I'm not going to use the default error code. Okay, now I'm going to define a method. Suppose in any case if we have any sub exception or sub errors are there, so we should also include that, and I'm just going to class API sub error. If sub errors are there, not there, then just simply create an empty error list, else sub errors dot add sub errors. Okay, API sub error. Okay, and now I'm going to add some validation methods here. Private add validation error, string field, object. So to fasten this code, I'm just going to skip this part, and I'm just going to directly going to the controller exception handler class where we'll be doing further code. Okay, so I have done developing this thing and I have created API error. Now I'm going to create one custom exception class. We'll name it as user not found exception or user invalid exception. I'm just going to name this class. So user not found, or I'm just going to invalid user exception. Extend this class with runtime parent exception, and I'm going to define one constructor inside this calling. Okay, and now coming back to my controller, now I'll be not throwing null pointer, I'll be throwing invalid user exception. Okay, with a message inside this, invalid null user ID has been provided. Okay, so this should be in the service class, not in the controller class, but I'm going to save some time, and so I'm just defining in the controller and showing how we are going to handle this. Okay, so I have already shown you like how we can handle this. If I'm going to my REST exception handler, and I'm just going to define annotation order and order dot highest. I'm just writing this so that this should be in the highest order precedence, because by default let me just also open that class, default handler exception resolver. This is the default exception resolver class that Spring Boot itself uses, and it returns a model and view object. So we have extended our class exception handler with response entity exception handler that is going to return a custom API error object. Okay, so let me just run this much amount of code and see if it works or not. Okay, let me just provide a null invalid input. So we can see still that error or exception has been thrown, but our custom exception has been thrown. But if we wanted to throw a custom object, JSON response object, we are going to use our own exception handler here. And let me first define a method so that my all methods are going to use this. Okay, I'm going to define this private response entity. Return type should be object, build response entity, and inside this I'm going to pass API error object, and I'm going to return response entity object inside this API error, and API error dot HTTP status I'm going to get. Now I'm going to define my custom exception handler, invalid user exception dot class, and I'm going to define this method as protected response entity object handle invalid user exception, and inside this same I'm going to pass my exception, and I'm going to return response entity object. Okay, and I'm going to inside this pass my API error object with HTTP status as OK, and invalid user dot exception message would be there, error code would be 101, and stack trace. Okay, so now I'm going to again run my program and see if the custom API error object should be returned in case of any invalid user or not. Okay, so this has been returned, and we can see 200 status should be there that I have already told you before starting the project. Like, we should always return a 200 HTTP status because we do not want to break up the UI code or API code for the user, because user doesn't want to see any breakable code or any red error messages. Okay, so 200 OK message should be perfectly fine, and with custom message invalid null user ID has been provided. This looks good, like you have provided a wrong user ID and should be corrected. Okay, so in this way we can handle a custom custom exception. And in any controller, suppose if I have defined a register controller or user controller, then I'm going to use this in handle invalid user exception. Okay, and I have defined this 101 error code, but there should be an error interface here also, and we should name it as, let me just define also, interface error code. And inside this we should define like invalid user ID, and it should be like 101. Okay, and 101 and string. Okay, and we should use here inside our REST exception handler, this should would be more readable. Suppose if any, okay, I have to define it in the integer format, integer, and it should be 1001. Perfect. So in this way we can define this for any custom exception and predefined exception. Okay, so in this way we can define it for a predefined exceptions. So okay, so that's it for today. Thank you guys.